August 10th, 1945. 0700 hours. Supreme Commander Allied Powers Headquarters, Manila. Colonel David Richardson, Army Intelligence, sat at his desk reviewing preliminary reports from the Kamaishi bombardment. The second strike completed just hours before the Emperor's surrender announcement. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Not from exhaustion, though he had not slept in 36 hours, but from a growing sense that something in the numbers did not align with what he had been telling himself for months. The reports detailed the destruction: 850 16-inch shells from battleships, 1,448-inch shells from heavy cruisers, 2,500 5-inch shells from destroyers, all fired at a city that had already been devastated 3 weeks earlier. We were preparing to do this to every coastal city in Japan. He whispered to no one. What Richardson did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the bombardment of Kamaishi represented not the terrible culmination of American naval power, but rather the smallest preview of what Operation Downfall would have required, and that, in the underground vaults of Japanese military headquarters, lay documents that would transform every assumption about the invasion they had been planning for 8 months. The mathematics were staggering. As Richardson would learn in the weeks to come, American forces had prepared 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, and over 400 destroyers and destroyer escorts for Operation Olympic alone. The invasion fleet would have escorted 14 American divisions to the beaches of Kyushu on November 1st, 1945. Operation Coronet, scheduled for March 1st, 1946, would have deployed 25 divisions in the initial assault, making it the largest amphibious operation in human history. But these numbers, impressive as they seemed, would prove to be only half of the equation. The other half, the Japanese half, remained hidden in captured documents that intelligence teams were only beginning to translate, in bunker complexes that reconnaissance teams were only starting to explore, in the testimonies of Japanese officers who were only now beginning to speak. The ratio that would emerge would haunt Richardson for the rest of his life. The world as he understood it. Richardson had joined the planning staff for Operation Downfall in January 1945, transferred from European theater intelligence after the Battle of the Bulge. He brought with him experience from North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. 4 major amphibious operations that had shaped his understanding of how invasions worked. The pattern seemed clear enough. Concentrated naval bombardment, overwhelming air superiority, numerically superior ground forces, and eventually, inevitably, the defenders' collapse. He had seen it work in 4 theaters. He had watched German positions, no matter how well fortified, crumble under the weight of Allied material superiority. The Japanese, he assumed, would be no different, just more fanatical, more willing to die, but ultimately no more capable of stopping the juggernaut of American industrial might. The planning documents he helped prepare reflected this confidence, this sense that the war's outcome was mathematically certain, that it was simply a matter of applying sufficient force to achieve the inevitable result. American intelligence estimated that approximately 3 hostile divisions would be disposed in southern Kyushu and an additional 3 in northern Kyushu at the initiation of Olympic. Total hostile forces committed against Kyushu operations, the reports confidently stated, would not exceed 8 to 10 divisions. For Honshu and Operation Coronet, they estimated approximately 21 hostile divisions, with 14 possibly employed in the Kanto Plain area. These were manageable numbers. The Allies would have local superiority at every landing beach. Naval gunfire would suppress defensive positions. Carrier aircraft would provide close air support. It would be difficult, certainly bloodier than Normandy, probably costlier than Okinawa, but achievable. The Joint Chiefs of Staff estimated at least 456,000 casualties for Operation Olympic alone. Some other evaluations ranged from 30,000 to 1 million. Richardson had helped write the intelligence annexes. He had believed the numbers. Throughout the spring and summer of 1945, as American naval forces began the systematic destruction of Japanese coastal cities, Richardson watched the reports accumulate. Kamaishi on July 14th, Muroran on July 15th, Hitachi on July 17th, and again on July 18th, with a stunning count of 1,207 16-inch shells and 292 6-inch shells. Hamamatsu on July 29th and 30th. The Japanese response in each case had been minimal, sometimes a small gunboat making a futile gesture. More often, nothing at all. The battleships fired at will. The cities burned. Japanese morale, according to intercepts and reports from neutral observers, was crumbling. Yutaka Akabane, a senior-level civil servant whose diary would later be recovered, had written in July, "Through May and June, the spirit of the people was crushed. The morale of the people sank terrifically, reaching a low point in July, at which time there was no longer hope of victory or draw, but merely desire for ending the war. Everything pointed to Japanese collapse. The naval blockade was complete. The aerial bombardment campaign had killed as many as 500,000 civilians since late 1944. Task Force 38 had destroyed what remained of the Japanese fleet in their home ports on July 24th and 28th, catching the ships without fuel, unable even to get underway. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to stationary targets. American submarines prowled Japanese waters unopposed. American B-29s flew over Japanese cities in broad daylight, sometimes dropping propaganda pamphlets instead of bombs. A psychological warfare tactic that seemed to be working. The war was over. Everyone could see it was over. It was just a matter of forcing the Japanese government to admit it. Operation Downfall would be the final hammer blow. Terrible but necessary. The coup de grace that would end the madness. Richardson had even allowed himself to hope that the invasion might not be necessary. That the combination of blockade, bombardment, and the shock of Soviet entry into the war might produce surrender before November 1st. When news came on August 6th that a new type of bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, he permitted himself cautious optimism. When a second bomb fell on Nagasaki on August 9th, he began to believe that Olympic might be canceled. And then, on August 15th, the Emperor's voice had crackled over Japanese radio, announcing surrender in language so archaic and formal that many Japanese listeners did not immediately understand what he was saying. The war was over. Operation Downfall would never be launched. Richardson felt relief wash over him, like a physical force. 456,000 casualties that would never happen. Maybe as many as 1 million American boys who would come home instead of dying on Japanese beaches. The first document, September 3rd, 1945. The formal surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay had been a moment of triumph. Douglas MacArthur's voice steady as he spoke of peace and reconciliation. But in the days and weeks that followed, as occupation forces moved into Japan, as intelligence teams began processing captured documents, as Japanese officers began to talk, a different story began to emerge. One that Richardson first encountered on September 11th in a manila folder marked Preliminary Assessment, Japanese Defensive Preparations, Kyushu. He opened the folder expecting confirmation of what he already knew, a few additional details about the defensive positions they would have faced, perhaps some interesting tactical notes about pillbox placements or beach obstacles. Instead, the first page hit him like a physical blow. Based on captured planning documents and prisoner interrogation, Japanese forces deployed to Kyushu by August 1945 totaled approximately 900,000 combat troops, not the 250,000 to 300,000 estimated in pre-invasion intelligence assessments. Ratio of defender to attacker forces, approximately 4.5 to 1 in favor of the defender at projected landing beaches. Richardson read the sentence 3 times. 900,000. The Americans were going to land 14 divisions, roughly 540,000 men in the initial assault, against 900,000 entrenched defenders. This was not the 3-to-1 attacker advantage that invasion doctrine required. This was not even parity. This was the attackers being outnumbered at the beachhead. He flipped to the next page, hoping for a clarification, an error, something that would restore his understanding of the world. Instead, he found a map showing Japanese divisional positions on Kyushu as of August 1st, 1945. There were not 8 to 10 divisions, as American intelligence had estimated. There were 16 divisions, plus 5 additional mixed brigades, plus substantial naval and Air Force ground troops, plus 3 tank brigades. Every single beach that Olympic planners had selected for landing sites was heavily defended. The Japanese had guessed correctly. They knew where the Americans were coming. If this is accurate, Richardson said aloud to the empty office, then everything we planned was based on fantasy. Over the following weeks, as more documents were translated, as more Japanese officers were interrogated, as more bunker complexes were explored and cataloged, the fantasy became clearer and the reality more nightmarish. A lieutenant from the Civil Censorship Detachment brought Richardson a captured Japanese military document dated July 25, 1945. A planning memorandum for Operation Ketsugo, the Japanese defense plan. Richardson read it slowly, using the attached translation, his hands growing cold despite the Manila heat. The document outlined the mobilization of 32 million civilians, every male between 15 and 60, every female between 17 and 45, all designated as combatants, all assigned to supplement the regular military. Weapons listed included Arisaka rifles, Model 99 light machine guns, hand grenades, and in cases where firearms were unavailable, bamboo spears, agricultural implements, and antique bronze cannons. 32 million, Richardson said to Captain James Mitchell, who had delivered the document. That's not an army. That's the entire population. It gets worse, sir, Mitchell replied, his voice flat. Keep reading. Richardson turned the page and found detailed instructions for civilian suicide attacks. Groups of 3 to 5 civilians armed with satchel charges or improvised explosives were to target American tanks and personnel carriers. Specific diagrams showed how to roll under tank treads, how to approach from blind spots, how to maximize casualties before being killed. Children, the document noted, were particularly effective for such missions because American soldiers might hesitate before firing. Richardson set the document down carefully, as if it might detonate. Did we know any of this? He asked. No, sir. Intelligence completely missed it. They thought the kamikaze aircraft were a last resort, a sign of desperation. Turns out it was doctrine, systematized, scaled up to include the entire population. We weren't planning to invade a country. We were planning to invade a suicide cult spanning 40 million people. The scale becomes clear. By October 1945, Richardson had been reassigned to a special intelligence assessment team tasked with evaluating what Operation Downfall would have actually encountered. The team's mission was clinical. Determine from captured documents and interviews exactly what the Japanese had prepared exactly what American forces would have faced. No spin, no politics, just the facts. The facts turned out to be almost incomprehensible. The first revelation concerned aircraft. American planning had assumed that Japanese air forces were largely destroyed, that the few remaining aircraft would be withdrawn to mainland Asia, that perhaps 2,000 to 2,500 planes could be massed for operations against the Kyushu landings. The captured documents told a different story. As of August 1st, 1945, Japan had over 10,000 aircraft of various types and sizes designated for kamikaze operations. Not 2,000, 10,000. Every single one programmed for suicide attack. Every pilot trained only in takeoff and basic flight, navigation skills unnecessary because they would not be returning. The aircraft ranged from modern fighters to obsolete trainers, from two-engine bombers to single-engine crop dusters. Anything that could carry a bomb or extra fuel and crash into a ship. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Palmer, Army Air Force, had been assigned to assess the kamikaze threat. He brought Richardson his preliminary report on October 19th. They were planning to throw everything at the invasion fleet during the approach and landing phase. Palmer explained, spreading reconnaissance photos across Richardson's desk. We've identified hidden airfields all across Kyushu and Honshu, dispersed to avoid our bombing. They were using highways as runways, converted rice paddies, anything flat enough for a takeoff. Based on interviews with Japanese Air Force officers, they planned to launch suicide attacks in waves of 300 to 400 aircraft at a time to overwhelm our carrier fighter screens. Richardson studied the photos. At Okinawa, conventional and kamikaze attacks had sunk 36 American ships and damaged 368 others. That was with perhaps 3,000 total Japanese aircraft committed over an 82-day battle. Operation Olympic was supposed to last much longer and would face 3 times as many aircraft, all of them kamikazes, all of them targeting the crowded invasion fleet in the relatively confined waters around Kyushu. How many ships would we have lost? Richardson asked. Palmer hesitated. The Navy won't commit to a number, but one carrier hit by a fully fueled aircraft carrying a 1,000-pound bomb doesn't just get damaged, it gets destroyed, or at least put out of action for months. We were bringing 42 carriers. How many could we afford to lose and still maintain air superiority for the ground forces? 10? 20? The Japanese had enough kamikazes to hit every major ship in the invasion fleet at least twice. The ground defenses proved equally daunting. Japanese forces had spent months preparing Kyushu for invasion, correctly anticipating which beaches the Americans would choose. Major Sarah Chen, working with captured engineering documents, briefed Richardson on the fortification system on November 2nd. They built approximately 70 miles of tunnels and underground complexes in the Miyazaki area alone, she reported. These aren't simple foxholes or bunkers. These are multi-level facilities with ammunition storage, food and water for months, electric lighting, ventilation systems, interconnected firing positions, and multiple concealed exits. Some complexes could house up to 2,000 soldiers. Naval bombardment would have been almost completely ineffective against these positions. What about bombing? Richardson asked. We had air superiority. We could have bombed them into submission before the landing. Chen shook her head. Sir, they learned from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These positions are designed to survive even direct hits from 2,000-pound bombs. The primary defensive positions are under 60 to 80 feet of rock and earth. We found facilities with 20 feet of reinforced concrete plus natural rock overburden. Post-bombing surveys at sites we did hit during July and August show minimal damage to the underground structures, even when the surface was completely cratered. And here's the thing that should terrify you. These positions were oriented not toward the beaches, but inland, designed for protracted defense in depth. They were planning to let us land, then bleed us in a war of attrition where our material superiority would matter less and less as we moved away from naval gunfire support. Richardson requested a full accounting of Japanese munitions stored in Kyushu. The report came back 3 weeks later. Approximately 600,000 tons of ammunition, artillery shells, mortar rounds, rifle cartridges, hand grenades, and explosives, distributed across hundreds of concealed depots. For comparison, the United States had consumed roughly 50,000 tons of ammunition per month during the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese had stockpiled enough on Kyushu alone to sustain intensive combat for more than a year, assuming no resupply. They had not been planning a short, glorious last stand. They had been planning a grinding war of annihilation. The human dimension. On November 28, 1945, Richardson interviewed Yoshio Nakamura, a former captain in the Imperial Japanese Army who had helped organize civilian militia training in Kumamoto Prefecture on Kyushu. Nakamura was 32 years old, a schoolteacher before the war, mid-level officer who had never expected to survive the invasion. He spoke through a translator, but his exhaustion and relief required no translation. He had been preparing to die and to oversee the deaths of thousands of civilians under his command, and the sudden end of the war had left him emotionally dislocated, unable to process the reprieve. We received approximately 40,000 civilians in our training program between June and August. Nakamura said, speaking slowly, carefully. Most were farmers, shopkeepers, elderly men, teenage boys, some women. We had perhaps 8,000 rifles, maybe 3,000 of them reliable. The rest received bamboo spears. We showed them how to sharpen the bamboo, how to aim for the throat or stomach, how to work in groups to bring down a soldier with a gun. The Americans would have body armor, we told them. So aim for the throat, always the throat. Richardson asked about the children. Nakamura's face went blank. The children were for the tanks, he said quietly. We told them they were soldiers, that the Emperor needed them, that their sacrifice would save Japan. We gave them satchel charges, showed them how to approach from the rear, how to throw themselves under the treads. Some were as young as 11 or 12. They practiced with sandbags rolling under mock-ups of American tanks. They were so proud, so eager to help. His voice broke. When the Emperor announced surrender, I went to the training ground where we had the children. I did not know what to tell them. They were crying, not because the war was over, but because they thought they had failed, that they would not have the chance to sacrifice themselves. I told them to go home. Many did not believe me. They thought it was a test of their loyalty. Richardson interviewed dozens of Japanese officers, soldiers, and civilians over the following months. Each interview added another layer to his understanding of what Operation Downfall would have encountered. Major Takeshi Yamamoto, Imperial Japanese Navy, described the Kaiten program, manned torpedoes with no escape mechanism, essentially underwater kamikazes. Japan had produced over 400 of these weapons by August, with production ramping up. We would have positioned them at the approaches to every landing beach, Yamamoto explained. The pilot sealed himself inside, aimed at the largest ship he could see, and accelerated to maximum speed. Impact was supposed to be at 40 to 50 knots. The warhead carried 3,000 pounds of explosives. One K-10 could sink a destroyer or cripple a cruiser. We had enough for every major ship in your invasion fleet. Sergeant Kenji Sato, who had been stationed in one of the underground fortifications near Ariake Bay, a primary Olympic landing beach, described the psychological preparation. They told us that we would all die, that there was no possibility of survival, that our deaths would be meaningful only if we took 10 Americans with us, each of us individually, 10 Americans dead for every Japanese soldier. This was the ratio we needed to make you stop, to make your people demand an end to the war. We believed it was possible. We had seen Okinawa. We knew you were not willing to accept unlimited casualties. On December 15th, Richardson interviewed Jiro Tanaka, a former civil servant who had worked in the Ministry of Munitions. Tanaka provided perhaps the most chilling testimony, a bureaucratic perspective on the systematic preparation for national suicide. We were planning for 3 phases of defense, Tanaka explained, speaking carefully, as if the plan still had validity. Phase 1 was the beach defense, intended to inflict maximum casualties during the landing and initial advance. We expected to lose this phase, but we hoped to destroy perhaps 30 to 40% of your invasion force before you secured a beachhead. Phase 2 was defense in depth, using the tunnel complexes and prepared positions. We expected this to last 3 to 6 months, during which we hoped to inflict casualties at a ratio of 3 to 1 in our favor. Phase 3 was the mobilization of the civilian population for guerrilla warfare. This phase had no planned end date. It would continue until either you withdrew or every Japanese person was dead. Did you believe this was achievable? Richardson asked. No, Tanaka said simply. But we believed it was necessary. We could not accept the alternative, which was surrender. So we planned for something that was probably impossible, and we tried to convince ourselves it was mandatory. The mathematics refined. By January 1946, Richardson's team had compiled enough data to produce a comprehensive assessment of what Operation Olympic would have encountered. The numbers were precise, documented, verified through multiple sources, and absolutely horrifying. The report Richardson drafted, classified top secret and distributed to only 37 recipients, laid out the mathematics of the unthinkable. Japanese forces on Kyushu, as of November 1st, 1945, projected strength, 900,000 combat troops, organized in 16 divisions, 5 mixed brigades, 3 tank brigades, and approximately 180,000 naval ground troops. American invasion force, 14 divisions, approximately 540,000 men in the initial assault. Ratio at landing beaches, approximately 2 to 1 in favor of defenders at some locations, as high as 5 to 1 at others. In conventional military doctrine, attackers need a 3 to 1 advantage to successfully assault fortified positions. Operation Olympic would have attempted the opposite, assaulting well-fortified positions while outnumbered. Kamikaze aircraft available for operations against the invasion fleet. 10,470 aircraft of all types, based on captured records of aircraft availability as of August 1st, 1945. At Okinawa, approximately 3,000 Japanese aircraft, including 1,900 kamikazes, had sunk 36 American ships and damaged 368. Proportionally, 10,000 kamikazes could be expected to sink or damage well over 1,000 vessels. The Operation Olympic invasion fleet totaled approximately 1,900 ships. Post-war analysis by the Navy suggested that sustaining the invasion would have been impossible if more than 30% of major vessels were lost or severely damaged. The Japanese had more than enough kamikazes to reach that threshold. Underground fortifications on Kyushu, approximately 950 major complexes with a combined capacity to shelter over 300,000 troops, along with ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies. Naval and aerial bombardment effectiveness against these installations, minimal. The American experience at Iwo Jima, where 3 days of intensive bombardment had failed to significantly degrade Japanese defenses, suggested that even weeks of preparatory bombardment would leave most defensive positions intact. Civilian militia mobilization. 32 million people, equipped with approximately 3 million rifles, 5 million edged weapons or bamboo spears, and trained in suicide attack tactics. While their military effectiveness would have been low in conventional terms, the psychological and practical impact of fighting an entire population willing to die would have extended the campaign indefinitely and made occupation of captured territory nearly impossible. Ammunition stockpiles. 600,000 tons on Kyushu alone, enough to sustain intensive combat for 12 to 18 months. Food supplies, adequate for military forces and designated militia for 6 months, assuming the entire civilian population was mobilized for combat, and normal consumption patterns were abandoned. American casualty estimates, based on ratios experienced at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, adjusted for the greater defensive strength and duration of the Kyushu campaign. Conservative estimate for Operation Olympic alone was 800,000 to 1 million casualties, including 200,000 to 300,000 killed. This was just for Kyushu. Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu and the advance on Tokyo, would face an even stronger defense, with over 2 million Japanese troops and the full mobilization of the civilian population in the Kanto Plain. Total American casualties for the complete conquest of Japan, estimated minimum of 1.5 million, with some assessments reaching as high as 4 million when factoring in extended guerrilla warfare and the impossibility of pacifying a population that had been systematically trained and equipped for suicide resistance. Richardson sat with these numbers for hours after finalizing the report. He tried to visualize 1 million casualties. He thought about the 500,000 Purple Heart medals that had been manufactured in preparation for Operation Downfall. Medals that would not be enough, that would need to be supplemented with emergency production. He thought about Nakamura's child soldiers, 11 and 12 years old, practicing with sandbags, so eager to die for the emperor. He thought about Tanaka's Phase 3, guerrilla warfare with no planned end date, continuing until every Japanese person was dead. The transformation. Richardson had begun his work on Operation Downfall with the confidence of a veteran intelligence officer who understood how wars ended, who had seen the pattern repeat across 2 theaters. He had believed that American material superiority would overcome Japanese fanaticism, that the invasion would be bloody but manageable, that the mathematics were on the Allied side. By February 1946, as he prepared his final assessment report, that confidence had been completely inverted. He wrote in his personal diary, later deposited at the Army War College, "Every assumption we made was wrong. We thought we understood the enemy's capabilities and his will to resist. We measured his industrial capacity, counted his divisions, estimated his supplies, and concluded that he was beaten, that it was simply a matter of administering the final blow. We were measuring the wrong things. We should have been measuring his willingness to die, the depth of his commitment to collective suicide, the extent to which an entire society could be mobilized for extinction. These things cannot be measured with bean counting and order of battle charts. We were planning to invade not a country, but a death cult that happened to occupy a country." The psychological journey from confidence to horror had been gradual. Revelation by revelation, document by document, interview by interview. Each new piece of evidence had chipped away at his assumptions until nothing remained but the recognition of how close they had come to something unthinkable. The atomic bombs had killed perhaps 220,000 people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. a number that haunted him, that haunted everyone who knew what those weapons had done. But Operation Downfall, he now understood, would have killed millions, perhaps tens of millions, Americans and Japanese both, and would have left Japan as a burned, depopulated wasteland, where once there had been a civilization thousands of years old. He attended a briefing on March 8, 1946, where a Navy intelligence officer discussed the Kaiten program in detail. The officer, Commander William Foster, had interviewed several Kaiten pilots who had survived the war without having to complete their missions. These were not desperate volunteers, Foster explained. These were carefully selected men, given months of training, treated as an elite unit. They wrote farewell letters to their families, performed ritual preparations, and entered, their weapons with the full expectation of death and the absolute conviction that their sacrifice was necessary and honorable. When the war ended, many of them were angry, not relieved. They felt cheated of their opportunity for meaningful death. Several attempted suicide when they learned of the surrender. This was the mindset we would have faced at every level of Japanese society if the invasion had proceeded. Richardson raised his hand. How many men were in the Kaiten program? Approximately 1,500 had completed training by August. Another 3,000 were in the pipeline. Production capacity was running at about 100 weapons per month. If the war had continued into 1946, they would have had thousands of these things, positioned at every harbor, every strait, every approach to every landing beach. Our submarines dealt with Japanese surface vessels by the middle of 1945. But submarines can't hunt Kaiten effectively. They're too small, too maneuverable, too close to shore. We would have been essentially helpless against them. After the briefing, Richardson walked along the Manila waterfront, watching cargo ships being loaded for the occupation of Japan, thinking about Foster's testimony. The United States had prepared the largest amphibious invasion in history. They had assembled overwhelming force, achieved total naval and air superiority, planned every detail with meticulous care. And they would have sailed that magnificent fleet straight into an underwater minefield of manned torpedoes, while overhead, 10,000 suicide planes dove through anti-aircraft fire. And on the beaches, 900,000 entrenched soldiers waited in tunnels that bombs could not reach. And behind them, 32 million civilians prepared to attack with bamboo spears and satchel charges, and children practiced rolling under tanks, and officers planned guerrilla warfare with no end date. And the entire enterprise was designed not to win, but to kill, to inflict such catastrophic casualties that the American people would demand withdrawal, or, failing that, to drag everyone down into mutual extinction. We would have done it, Richardson said to himself, watching the sunset over Manila Bay. We would have launched Olympic. We would have lost half the invasion fleet to kamikazes. We would have landed on the beaches and faced 5-to-1 odds. We would have advanced inland and fought in tunnels for months. We would have killed and died and kept going, because that is what we do. Because we thought we were fighting an army when we were actually fighting a civilization that had chosen death. And we would have won, eventually, because our industrial capacity was limitless and our will was strong. But the cost, my God, the cost, the broader context, the scale of Japanese preparations for Operation Ketsugo, Richardson came to understand, reflected a fundamental asymmetry in how the two sides understood the war's endgame. American planning assumed that sufficient military pressure would lead to rational surrender, that at some point the Japanese government would recognize the futility of continued resistance and accept the inevitable. Japanese planning assumed that sufficient casualties inflicted on American forces would lead to negotiated settlement, that at some point the American people would decide the cost of total victory was too high and accept something less than unconditional surrender. Both assumptions, Richardson realized, were probably wrong. The United States, having invested 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives in defeating Japan, was not going to accept anything less than total victory, regardless of the cost. The Japanese government, having committed to national suicide as preferable to surrender, was not going to give up while any military or civilian capacity to resist remained. The war would have continued until one side was physically incapable of fighting, which in Japan's case meant the death of most of the adult population and the destruction of every city, town, and village across the home islands. The historical context made this outcome almost inevitable. Japan's militarist government had spent 15 years indoctrinating the population in the virtues of death before dishonor, of loyalty to the emperor as the highest value, of surrender as the ultimate shame. The kamikazes were not an aberration, but the logical culmination of this ideology. When that ideology was applied to an entire population and backed by months of systematic military preparation, the result was Operation Ketsu Go, a plan for national self-destruction on a scale that had no historical precedent. Richardson reviewed Japanese production figures for 1944 and 1945, trying to understand how a nation with such limited industrial capacity had prepared such an extensive defense. The answer lay in resource reallocation. Japan had essentially abandoned all production not directly related to homeland defense after March 1945. No new warships were laid down. Aircraft carrier construction stopped. Submarine production ended. Naval aviation diminished to nothing. Every factory, every resource, every worker was redirected toward building kamikazes, stockpiling ammunition, training militia, and constructing underground fortifications. It was not efficiency. It was systematic cannibalization of every military capability except the one thing necessary for Operation Ketsugo. This created a kind of strategic singularity. Japan could not win the war in any conventional sense. They had no capacity to project power beyond their home islands, no ability to interdict American supply lines, no hope of defending their remaining overseas territories. But they could, just barely, create enough defensive capability in the home islands to make an invasion catastrophically expensive. And catastrophically expensive, they gambled, might be enough to achieve something less than total defeat. They were preparing not for victory, but for a draw, and they were willing to accept near total annihilation to achieve it. The final irony. Richardson submitted his final report on April 2nd, 1946. The document was classified top secret and restricted to a distribution list that included the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of War, and President Truman. Richardson never knew if Truman read it. The report concluded, based on comprehensive analysis of captured Japanese documents, interrogation of military and civilian personnel, and inspection of defensive preparations on Kyushu, this assessment concludes that Operation Olympic, if launched on November 1st, 1945, would have encountered Japanese defensive forces approximately 3 times stronger than pre-invasion intelligence estimates indicated. Japanese forces totaling 900,000 combat troops, supported by 10,000 kamikaze aircraft and 32 million mobilized civilians, occupied extensively fortified positions designed to maximize American casualties and prolong the campaign indefinitely. American casualties for Operation Olympic alone would likely have exceeded 1 million, with total casualties for the conquest of Japan potentially reaching 4 million. The assumption that Japanese resistance would collapse under military pressure proved incorrect. Japanese planning called for sustained defense regardless of casualties. with the explicit goal of making the invasion so costly that the United States would seek negotiated settlement. The use of atomic weapons, while controversial, prevented casualties on both sides that would have dwarfed Hiroshima and Nagasaki by orders of magnitude. This assessment recommends that all future military planning acknowledge the possibility that ideologically motivated opponents may choose collective death over surrender, and that conventional military advantage does not guarantee acceptable costs for victory against such opponents. On August 6, 1946, the first anniversary of Hiroshima, Richardson attended a memorial service in Tokyo. General MacArthur spoke about reconciliation, about building a peaceful, democratic Japan from the ashes of the old militarist state. Richardson stood at the back of the ceremony, watching Japanese civilians placing flowers at the memorial, many of them crying, all of them subdued. He thought about Nakamura's child soldiers, who were now back in school, learning mathematics and literature instead of how to die under tanks. He thought about the teenage boys who would have been K-10 pilots, who were now working to rebuild their cities. He thought about the 32 million militia members who had been training to attack American soldiers with bamboo spears, who were now planting rice and trying to survive the post-war food shortage. The atomic bombs had killed perhaps 220,000 people. Operation Downfall would have killed millions. The bombs had ended the war in days. The invasion would have lasted into late 1946 or even 1947, with guerrilla warfare potentially continuing for years afterward. The bombs had left Hiroshima and Nagasaki in ruins. The invasion would have left all of Japan in ruins. It was not a comparison that made the bombs good or moral or right, but it was a comparison that made them less terrible than the alternative that had been avoided. We were so close, Richardson said quietly to himself, standing in the August heat. So close to doing something that would have been remembered as the greatest tragedy in human history. Worse than any atrocity, worse than any genocide, because it would have been mutual, deliberate, and avoidable. And we would have done it because we believed we had to. And they would have accepted it because they believed they had to. And millions would have died because both sides were trapped by assumptions about honor and victory and the price of peace. The museum, June 12, 2005. The Yushukan Military Museum in Tokyo. A retired American colonel, James Richardson, son of David Richardson, stood before an exhibit on Operation Ketsugo, the planned Japanese defense of the homeland. The exhibit included captured planning documents, photographs of the underground fortifications, a map showing the deployment of the 900,000 troops on Kyushu. In a glass case at the center of the display sat a bamboo spear, sharpened to a point, the weapon that 32 million civilians had been training to use against American tanks and soldiers. A Japanese teenager, perhaps 16 years old, stood next to James Richardson, staring at the bamboo spear. My great-grandfather was going to use one of these, the teenager said in careful English, reading the placard. He was 53 years old in August 1945, a farmer. They gave him this bamboo spear and told him to kill Americans. He would have tried. He would have died. My father planned the invasion, James Richardson replied. He was an intelligence officer. He helped figure out where to land, how many troops to use, what the casualties would be. He got all the numbers wrong. They were going to land 14 divisions. You had 16 divisions plus all the extras. They thought you had 300,000 troops. You had 900,000. They thought it would cost 450,000 casualties. My father thought it would actually cost over 1 million, maybe more. The teenager looked at the bamboo spear again. The atomic bombs killed 220,000 people, he said. My grandmother was from Nagasaki. She survived, but she lost her parents, her brothers, most of her friends. I know, James Richardson said. It was terrible. But this, he gestured at the exhibit, at the bamboo spear, at the map showing the massive Japanese forces arrayed against the invasion beaches. This would have been worse. Much worse. Your great-grandfather would have died with his bamboo spear. My father's generation would have died on the beaches. Millions of people would have died. Maybe 10 million. Maybe more. The atomic bombs ended it before that could happen. The teenager nodded slowly. My history teacher says we can never know what would have happened if there was an invasion. Maybe Japan would have surrendered before November. Maybe the casualties would have been lower than the estimates. Maybe something else would have changed. Maybe, James Richardson agreed. But my father spent 6 months after the war finding out exactly what you were planning to do. He interviewed Japanese officers, read your documents, inspected your fortifications. He became convinced that the invasion would have been the worst mistake in American military history. Not because we would have lost, but because we would have won at a cost that would have made the victory worthless. And the atomic bombs, as terrible as they were, prevented that. That is what he believed for the rest of his life. They stood together in silence, an American and a Japanese separated by 2 generations, and connected by a history that almost happened, by an invasion that never took place, by millions of deaths that were prevented by 220,000 deaths that did occur. The mathematics remained staggering, the moral calculus impossible, the historical judgment forever contested. But the bamboo spear in its glass case, sharpened and prepared and never used, stood as testament to what both nations had been willing to do, to what they had prepared to do, and to the terrible blessing of the abrupt ending that had spared them from finding out whether they actually would have done it. The Kamaishi bombardment on August 9th, 1945, which had seemed to Colonel Richardson like the culmination of American naval power, had actually been the last whisper before silence. The final shell fired before the war ended. 850 16-inch shells that represented not the terrible capacity of American forces to destroy Japanese cities, but rather the infinitesimal preview of what would have followed if Operation Downfall had proceeded, if the invasion fleet had sailed, if the 14 divisions had landed on the beaches of Kyushu, if the 900,000 defenders had emerged from their tunnels, if the 10,000 kamikazes had taken flight, if the 32 million civilians had picked up their weapons, if the mathematics of the unthinkable had been carried through to their logical conclusion. The invasion that never happened remained the great shadow over the ending of the Pacific War. The catastrophe that was prepared, planned, resourced, ready to launch, and avoided only by a technological breakthrough that itself was catastrophic but less so, that killed hundreds of thousands but not millions, that destroyed 2 cities but not an entire nation, that ended the war in days instead of years and left both sides with populations capable of recovery instead of mutual extinction. History would forever debate the morality of the atomic bombs, but the mathematics, at least, were undeniable. 220,000 deaths were terrible, but they were still only a fraction of the deaths that had been prepared for, that both sides had accepted as necessary. That would have occurred if the invasion had proceeded as planned. The bamboo spear in the museum stood as witness to the road not taken, to the deaths not inflicted, to the children who grew up instead of dying under tanks, to the civilization that survived because the war ended before the final arithmetic of annihilation could be performed.